Breaking the wall of global poverty. How development economics changes the lives of the world's poorest. Esther Duflo, Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
On the 9th of November 1989, I was a high school student in Paris, discussing the events in Berlin with my friends.
Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. I'd like you to meet a little girl. She's called Bokya. She lives in Tanzania. She has 6 or 7 brothers and sisters. Her parents are very poor, subsistence farmer. She's really excited about school. So with just a little bit of help, you can help us, a few $20 a month. You can really help her and her family go through school and make a living for herself. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up. Well, in reality, Bokya does not exist. She was invented, or someone very much like her, was invented by a team of psychologists led by Paul Slovin as part of a small randomized controlled trials, which was meant to shed some light about one wall that prevents us to solve the problem of global poverty, which is very much inside our head. So what they did is to go towards some students who were having their lunch in the cafeteria in Wharton, a business school in the US, and they showed them flyers to propose them to give some money to Save the Children, which is a very reputable NGO helping kids around the world. And some of the flyers had Bokya, and some of the flyers had statistics about millions of kids and adults who are at risk of famines all over the world. Now, we can start with a little poll, if you will. How many of you think that Bokya raised more money than the millions of starving people? To the vast majority of people, and of course, you're right, nobody was vastly successful, but Bokya is definitely more successful. She raised much more money than the millions of starving people. So then what the researchers decided to do is to say, well, suppose we made people aware of that bias that we have towards identifiable victim of a particular problem to think about problems more widely. So they ran exactly the same experiment, but before showing the flyer, they said, we want to remind you that we tend to be a little bit biased towards an identifiable victim versus understanding the problem at large. So how many of you think that that manipulation changed something to the fundraising capability of Bokya versus the millions of starving people? So there you're quite wrong. It did change something, but unfortunately, it didn't go all that well. So what it did is that it made people smart about Bokya and said, oh, well, I'm not going to let myself be persuaded by these little girls, because really what's behind her is this much bigger problem that I don't really know what to do something about. And that's a general problem. We tend to be much more drawn towards problems that can be identified to a single person. In fact, it turns out that Bokya is more successful at raising money than Bokya and her little brother. Or sometimes we can also be excited or be interested or become very generous when there is a big catastrophe. For example, when the Haiti earthquake struck, 200,000 people died in a very short period of time, and there was an outpouring of generosity. And that's great, but something that is useful to compare it to is that if you take just childhood mortality, the number of kids who die under the age of 5 for purely preventable reasons, that is about the equivalent of a Haiti earthquake every 8 days. And yet, there is no similar outpouring of generosity to this problem. And clearly, it's not because we are not generous. It's, I think, because of some walls that are inside our head that are somewhat caricatural view of what it is to be poor. And roughly speaking, these walls are of two kinds. On the one hand, some people think that the poor are lazy. So I don't know how many of you read Tintin and read it in French. This is Tintin in Congo. And there is this cartoon. Usually Tintin is not naked, but I chose one where he's naked, where he's basically berating the poor for being lazy, and the little dog is helping you taking care of the train, but the poor won't do even that much. And that's one first type of caricature. The poor are lazy, that's kind of why they are poor, and if we are trying to help them, we being the government of the country or being aid, we might make the problem even worse. At the other extreme is another caricature, which comes from maybe a nicest place in their heart, but arrives at the same outcome in terms of policy recommendation, which is that, oh, the poor are not lazy, on the contrary, they are natural-born entrepreneurs. We have nothing to do. We just have to let them figure out their own way, and they will get out of poverty. And both of these caricatures leads one to inaction. And I want to say that these caricatures are shared with us in the West, but they're also shared with the richest people and policymakers in many developing countries. So what is my work trying to do against that? My work is trying to replace caricature with a scientific approach of thinking about the problems that the poor are facing in their life. In particular, I work with and help others work with a tool that's the tool of randomized controlled trials, which we didn't invent, which is a core part of modern medicine, which is the way that you test a new molecule or a new medicine. The example of the Bokya flyers was already a first example of a randomized controlled trials. People were presented for random reasons with very different flyers, and we compared their reaction. Let me give you another example to tie it more directly to poverty, which is an example I deeply care about, which is the question of childhood immunization. We do know that there are vaccines that save lives. This is the cheapest way to save life, and yet there are about 25 million kids every year who are not immunized. So we worked in an area of Rajasthan, a tribal area in Udaipur, Rajasthan, where at baseline, only 1% of the kids aged 2 were fully immunized, had gotten the 5 shots that correspond to full immunization in the EPI. Most policymakers in India think that this is mainly a problem of supply. So this is an example of a primary health sub-centers where people are supposed to get their immunization in Udaipur. You can see that it is closed. It is closed most of the time. So people find it, of course, very difficult to get immunized because there is no place to get immunized. So the government is mostly acting on that margin, trying to improve the supply, but it's very difficult. Now, on top of the supply problem, there could also be a demand problem, some fundamental having to do with trust or lack of information, and some less fundamental having to do with the fact that every poor person has to deal with any number of things in their life at any given moment. And immunization is never really the most urgent thing you have to do because you have to put food on the table and you have to make sure that there is no flooding in the house and things like that. So it will tend to be postponed because there is no urgency today. And against that procrastination, maybe a small reminder or small reasons to do it today rather than to wait might help. So to test this idea, we ran an experiment. So basically, this is Udaipur, and on these are our villages. In the white villages, we did nothing in particular. The red villages, we did the standard government response of setting up camps and for immunization. And in the red villages, we also added small incentives for people to be immunized. So because the places are randomized, you can see that they are spread all over the region. Of course, the villages are the same, except that some got an intervention, some got another one. So these are the results that we got. So of course, at baseline, everything was the same, because they were randomized. That would have been troubling otherwise. By endline, there is some progress in the control group where nothing was done, because the government was active anyway. That controls for what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. where the camps were put in place, full immunization rates improved to 17%. That's not bad. But by adding the lentils, which are costing just about $0.50 per person per immunization, the immunization rate went up to 40%, almost 40%. And the reason why it's important is that it turns out that it's financially more sustainable to provide the incentive than not to provide the incentive. The reason being that if you're going to have a camp and a nurse that is there sitting there immunizing children, it is less expensive per shot given to have more people coming to the camp. So here it's a little bit counterintuitive that the intervention where you give people a little bit extra is actually more cost-effective than the one where you don't. So what I do in my lab, which is really more a network than a lab, is to try and encourage this type of experimentation on problem-by-problem basis all over the world. So their work is spread across 7 global offices. We work on poverty in rich countries and in poor countries. And you can see that we have about 860 projects, which are either ongoing or completed, across a variety of domains, from health to agriculture to education to corruption, etc. So in all of that, what have we learned, you might want to know? There are, of course, a number of insights, but I'm going to give you just 3 small ones. The first one is that there are poverty traps. There are walls that are keeping people in poverty. There are reasons why if you're poor, you stay poor, and we can break those walls with interventions that are large enough. So this is a program that was designed by the Bangladeshi organization BRAC, and they call it the ultra-poor program because they identify the poorest person in the village with the help of the villagers. They go to them and they provide them with an asset. And then for a year and a half, they support them a lot with that asset, and then they leave them on their own. And what we found by evaluating this program, here I'm showing you the result for India, but we have done it in 7 countries, is that after a year and a half, this is the first graph here, you can see that the people in the program do better than the people who are not in the program. After the 3 years, they still do better, even though they haven't gotten any help for a year and a half. And after 7 years, they've really broken out. The second insight, and the last 2 insights refers to my first few myths, is that the poor are not lazy. Of course, that seems a bit caricatural. Everybody here would agree the poor are not lazy, but really think deep within yourself. Maybe you think the poor are a little bit lazy. The way we think about it is that typically we are very reluctant as citizens or policymakers to endorse programs that are cash assistance. The reason is that we are worried that it's going to be misused. They are going, the husband are going to take the money and drink alcohol with it, or people are going to stop working once we help them. But the fact is that it's not true. And the reason why we know it's not true is that there are now dozens of randomized control trials of cash transfers to the poor, conditional or unconditional. We have analyzed with my colleagues these dozens of randomized control trials. And once you look at them, not in the single one of them is there people stop working once they get assistance, or people start misusing the money in any kind of way. So we can really relax about providing a little bit of help to the poor. It's not going to be misused. On the contrary, it helps, as in the example of the ultra-poor program that I was just describing, launch people on a different trajectory. The second, however, is that nor are they just natural-born entrepreneurs. And this was the main idea behind the huge success of the microcredit movement, which did a lot of good, but started with the idea that it's enough to give a loan and you can recover it with interest, and people will be better off as a result. These type of programs have been now studied in 7 or 8 countries with randomized control trials. And trial after trial, you find that they don't do any bad, but they don't do much good. And in particular, they are not transformational. They are the equivalent of a credit card or a consumption loan for the vast majority of people. So where are we? What are those poverty traps made of? Is it poor health? Is it little trust in the system? Is it poor information? Is it lack of access to insurance? Well, the reality is that it is a little bit of all of this. Each of these you want to think not as the wall, but as a brick in that wall. Our job is not to find a big breaking ball that's going to break the entire wall. Our job is to identify this brick. But once we understand that, time is on our side. These experiments that we are doing in Nepal, they are changing the world's life. Today, 300 million poor people are covered by policies that have something to do with what we are doing. And state and government are changing the country. So it's not easy, because you have to experiment. Sometimes the obvious answer is not the right one. Sometimes practicality has to trump ideology. But you make progress. This is very much like 20th century in medicine. We haven't cured cancer, but we have saved, through 20th century, millions of lives. And the same can be done with poverty. Thank you very much.